There are moments in your life that split everything into two, before and after. Before you knew the truth, after you couldn't unknow it. This is one of those stories. And I want you to stay with me because every single detail matters. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 26 years old, sitting in the front row of my sister's wedding in a dress I didn't choose, next to a mother who hadn't spoken to me with genuine warmth in over a year, and I had a secret burning a hole straight through my chest. But let me take you back, way back, because this story doesn't start at the wedding. It starts the night I found out who my sister really was. Growing up, Chloe was always the golden one. You know the type. Effortlessly beautiful, the kind of person who walks into a room and everyone shifts their attention without even meaning to. She was 2 years older than me, and she wore that seniority like a crown. Our parents, mom especially, worshipped her. I don't say that with bitterness, at least not the kind I used to carry. I say it because it's simply true. Every school play, Chloe got the lead. Every family argument, Chloe was believed first. Every birthday, Chloe's was bigger. And me? I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got good grades but never quite got the applause. I had made peace with that, or so I thought. Turns out, peace and repression look a lot alike when you're 20-something and still trying to earn your family's approval. Fast forward to 3 years ago, Chloe started dating Marcus. Marcus was, and I genuinely mean this, one of the most decent human beings I had ever met. Tall, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered what you'd said 3 weeks ago and asked follow-up questions. He worked in civil engineering, volunteered on weekends, called his mom every Sunday. I liked Marcus immediately. More than that, I trusted him. And that trust, that's the part that mattered, because it's what made what happened next so completely devastating. It was a Thursday evening, a little over 18 months before the wedding. I'd stopped by Chloe's apartment to drop off a birthday gift for her roommate. I didn't call ahead, which in hindsight changed everything. I used the spare key Chloe had given me for emergencies, let myself into the hallway, and heard voices. I almost called out. Almost, but some small, quiet instinct made me stop. The voice I heard wasn't Chloe's roommate. It wasn't a friend. It was a man, and the way they were laughing, that low, intimate kind of laughter that belongs only to people who know each other in the way they shouldn't, made my stomach drop before my brain had even caught up. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an entire lifetime, and then I heard his name. Not spoken by Chloe, spoken by him. He said her name back to her, and the tenderness in his voice was unmistakable. That voice was Daniel's. Daniel, who had been my best friend's boyfriend for 2 years. Daniel, who had just last month attended Marcus's birthday dinner with us and shaken his hand like a respectable human being. Daniel, in my sister's apartment on a Thursday afternoon. I left without making a sound. I sat in my car for 40 minutes and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Not because I had any romantic feelings for Daniel, I didn't, but because I suddenly understood something with a clarity that was almost physical. My sister was the kind of person who could look someone in the eyes and smile while carrying something like this. And if she could do it to my friend's boyfriend, what else was she capable of? What I did next, I am not proud of. I said nothing. I convinced myself it wasn't my place. I told myself maybe I had misunderstood, even though I hadn't. And I watched as 6 months later, Daniel broke up with my friend, leaving her absolutely shattered, with no explanation that made any sense. I watched Chloe comfort her at the time, and I said nothing. Sisterhood, right? And then, almost like the universe had a plan I hadn't been consulted on, Chloe announced her engagement to Marcus, and the whole family celebrated like it was the second coming. The engagement party was held at my parents' house. A beautiful evening in early autumn. Fairy lights strung across the garden, champagne and real glasses. My mother in her favorite navy dress, looking at Chloe like she had single-handedly solved world peace. Marcus stood beside Chloe with this expression, you know the one, where someone is so genuinely happy that you almost feel guilty for being in the same room with your secrets. And I stood there, holding my glass, smiling when I was supposed to smile, laughing when I was supposed to laugh, while something twisted itself tighter and tighter inside me with every toast. Because by that point, I knew. Not just about Daniel, about more. See, after the engagement, I did what any person with anxiety and internet access does. I started piecing things together. Quietly. Carefully. Not out of obsession, I want to be clear about that, but because once you've seen someone operate the way I saw Chloe operate, you can't help but wonder what else you've missed. What I found, and I want to say this slowly because I need you to really hear it, was that Daniel had not been the first. There was a pattern, a careful, deliberate, almost artful pattern. There had been at least 2 other men during periods when Chloe was in committed relationships her partners thought were serious, exclusive, and heading somewhere real. She was skilled at it, not reckless. She never left a trail of obvious evidence. She maintained her image, loving girlfriend, fun sister, devoted daughter, with a consistency that was honestly breathtaking in the worst possible way. And throughout all of this, she had been dating Marcus. Sweet, oblivious, completely devoted Marcus, who was now buying her a ring and telling everyone she was the love of his life. Here is where it gets complicated for me, because what do you do with information like that? I went back and forth, endlessly, exhaustingly, for months. I thought about telling Marcus directly, but I barely knew him well enough at that point, and I was terrified he wouldn't believe me, or worse, that he'd tell Chloe and Chloe would tell my parents, and I would become the villain of a story I hadn't written. I thought about staying silent, letting Marcus find out on his own, if he ever did, living with it, moving on. But then something happened that changed my calculation entirely. About 8 months before the wedding, my friend, the one Chloe had comforted so tenderly after Daniel's inexplicable breakup, found out the truth about Daniel and Chloe on her own. Someone who knew them both had let it slip at a party. She called me, sobbing, asking if I had known, and I had to tell her. I had to sit on the phone and tell her that yes, I had seen them together, and I had stayed quiet, and I was sorry, and I knew sorry wasn't enough. She hung up. She didn't speak to me for 3 months. 3 months during which I sat with the full weight of what silence costs, not just the person you're protecting information from, but yourself. Every day you hold something like that is another day it grows heavier, another day you look in the mirror and recognize yourself a little less. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. But I also wasn't going to be impulsive. I was going to be methodical, careful, because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it in a way that could not be dismissed, could not be reframed, could not be twisted into a story about jealous little sister sabotaging perfect Chloe's perfect life. I collected everything. Everything. Screenshots from people who were willing to share them, a timeline of overlapping relationships corroborated by multiple people who each only knew one piece of the puzzle, testimony from my friend who eventually came back to me and said, and I will never forget this, if you're going to do something, I want to be part of it. I had dates, I had names, I had a folder on my laptop that I kept encrypted and backed up in 2 separate places because yes, I was that serious. Was it excessive? Probably. Did it feel necessary? Absolutely. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about exposing someone you love, or someone you used to love, or someone you're supposed to love because they share your blood. The bar for being believed is unfairly high. People don't want it to be true. They'll look for any reason to doubt you. So you have to be airtight. You have to be unimpeachable. You have to walk in with receipts so undeniable that denial becomes impossible. And that is exactly what I did. Before I go any further, and trust me, it gets so much more intense from here, if you're invested in this story, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to decide between keeping the peace and telling the truth, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in my position. Would you have spoken up sooner? Would you have stayed silent? I genuinely want to know, and those comments and likes help small creators like me more than you know. It really does mean the world. Okay, back to the story. The wedding was set for the last Saturday in June, a venue out in the countryside, one of those converted barn-style places with exposed beams and wildflower arrangements and a string quartet for the ceremony. My parents had contributed significantly to the cost. Marcus's family had flown in from 3 different cities. There were 112 guests on the list. And I was the maid of honor, or rather, I had been the maid of honor, up until 5 weeks before the wedding when Chloe sat me down over coffee and told me, in the carefully measured tones of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, that she had decided to ask her best friend Petra to take the role instead, because, and I quote, "I just feel like Petra really gets my vision for the day and I don't want there to be any tension." Tension. She said tension, as if I were the one creating it, as if something in my manner, some barely perceptible stiffness in the way I smiled at her, some microscopic hesitation before I said, "You look beautiful," had tipped her off that I wasn't entirely on her side. Maybe I wasn't as careful as I thought, or maybe Chloe, having spent years operating in the shadows, had developed a radar for when someone knew too much. Either way, being removed as maid of honor was the last push I needed. Not because I cared about the title, I didn't, but because it told me something important. Chloe knew, on some level, that I was a threat, which meant she was going to be watching me, which meant if I was going to do what I had decided to do, the timing would be everything. I want to pause here and be honest with you, the way I haven't been able to be honest with most people in my life about this. There was a part of me, small but real, that genuinely grieved. Grieved for the sister I had wanted Chloe to be. Grieved for the fantasy of the family where everyone was who they said they were. I had loved Chloe, in the complicated way you love someone who has never quite let you in. And doing what I was about to do meant closing a door that, once closed, could never be reopened. I cried about that, multiple times. I want to be clear, this wasn't about revenge, or not entirely. It was about a man who deserved to know who he was marrying before he stood at an altar and gave his life to someone who had never given him the full truth of hers. It was about my friend, whose heart had been broken by someone who sat across from her at dinner and looked her in the eyes. It was about every version of me that had stayed quiet and called it loyalty, when really it was fear. The week before the wedding, I told Marcus. Not everything, not the full documented folder, not the timeline, not the names, just enough. I asked him to meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, under the pretense of a wedding logistics question, and I sat across from him and I said, as carefully as I could, that there were things about Chloe's past that I believed he deserved to know before the wedding. He went very still, that kind of stillness that isn't peace. It's a person processing something their body understood before their mind caught up. He asked me what I meant. I told him about Daniel, about the timeline, about what I had seen that Thursday evening 18 months ago, and what I had pieced together in the months since. I put a single printed page on the table between us, just dates and names, no photographs, nothing sensationalist, and I let him read it. He read it twice, then he folded it, then he thanked me, then he left. And for 6 days, I heard absolutely nothing, not from Marcus, not from Chloe, not from my parents. 6 days of complete, suffocating silence, during which I genuinely did not know if the wedding was still happening, if Marcus had confronted Chloe, if Chloe had somehow turned the narrative around, or if I was about to walk into a room of 112 people who all hated me. The morning of the wedding, I got a text from Marcus. Just 3 words. Still going ahead. 3 words. I read them about 11 times. Still going ahead. which could have meant anything. That he hadn't believed me, that he'd confronted Chloe and she'd convinced me I was lying, that he'd decided to go through with it anyway for reasons I couldn't fathom, or, and this was the possibility that made my hands shake, that he had a plan of his own and was waiting for the right moment. I didn't know. I got dressed. I put on the burgundy guest dress my mother had selected for me, not the maid of honor dress, obviously, since I'd been replaced by Petra, and I drove to the venue with my heart somewhere between my throat and my stomach. The barn was breathtaking, genuinely. Wildflowers everywhere, soft morning light filtering through the skylights, the string quartet playing something delicate and aching in the corner. Guests were already arriving. Aunts, cousins, Marcus's colleagues, family friends I recognized from childhood. Everyone looked so happy, so thoroughly, innocently, radiantly happy. And why wouldn't they be? It was a beautiful wedding. Chloe, when I saw her, looked extraordinary. I have to say that because it's true. She was in this ivory gown with a low back and a cathedral train that she had clearly agonized over for months, and she looked like every glossy wedding magazine cover ever produced. She was glowing, literally glowing, and she looked at me when I walked into the bridal suite. Petra had graciously allowed me 5 minutes, and she smiled this slow, careful smile that said, "I know you tried something and it didn't work, and today I win." I smiled back. I said she looked beautiful. I meant neither the smile nor the words. And then I went to find my seat. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock. I sat 3 rows back on the aisle, not the front row since that was reserved for the maid of honor's family, which apparently no longer included me in any meaningful way. The music shifted to the processional. Petra walked first, luminous in blush pink, then the bridesmaids, then, after a breathless theatrical pause, Chloe on my father's arm, to a collective gasp from the entire room. She had timed it perfectly, of course she had. My father was weeping openly, which I had never seen him do in my entire life. My mother, in the front row, had her hand pressed to her mouth, and Marcus was standing at the altar, and when Chloe appeared at the end of that aisle, something crossed his face that I could not read from where I was sitting, not the uncomplicated joy I had seen at the engagement party, something more layered, more complicated, something that looked, if I'm being honest, like a man who had been given information he was still deciding what to do with. The ceremony proceeded. The officiant spoke. There were readings, a poem, a passage, the usual architecture of a wedding ceremony, and then they reached the vows. Marcus went first. I learned this later, and they were articulate and specific and clearly came from a real place. He spoke about trust, about honesty, about building a life with someone who was truly known to you. He used the word truth 3 times. I counted. Chloe's smile didn't waver, but something around her eyes shifted, the tiniest tightening, and I understood in that moment that Marcus had told her nothing. She didn't know that he knew. She thought she had won. And then the officiant said the words every ceremony reaches eventually. If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. A ritual, a formality. Nobody ever actually speaks. That's the understanding. That's the social contract every wedding operates on. The silence that follows is ceremonial, comfortable, expected. Nobody told Marcus that. Because Marcus lowered the hand he was holding, lowered it gently, carefully, with a tenderness that somehow made what happened next even more devastating, and he said, "Actually, I need a moment." The string quartet stopped mid-breath. 112 people went so absolutely perfectly still that I could hear the wildflowers. I have replayed that moment so many times since. The way sound seemed to evacuate the room, the way Chloe turned to look at Marcus and her face went through 6 different emotions in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion, irritation, a flicker of something that looked like fear. and then a smile so fast it was almost a reflex. The smile of someone who has spent years managing situations by smiling them away. Marcus turned to face the guests. He looked calm, unnervingly, almost eerily calm, like a man who had made peace with something very difficult over the preceding 6 days and arrived at this moment with absolute clarity. He said, and I'm paraphrasing because I was frankly not breathing well enough to memorize exact words, that he loved Chloe, that he had been ready to spend his life with her, that he had believed genuinely and completely that she was the person she presented herself to be. And then he said that he had been given information recently, information he had spent 6 days trying to disprove and couldn't, that fundamentally changed what he understood about the relationship he was standing in. He didn't name names, he didn't make accusations, he didn't shout or cry or perform. He just said, quietly, that he could not in good conscience stand at an altar and make vows he now had reason to doubt, and that he was sorry, deeply sorry, to everyone who had traveled to be here, to both families, to everyone who had invested in this day. And then he took Chloe's hand one more time, and he said, just to her, but the room was so silent that everyone heard, "I deserved to know the truth, and so did you." He placed her hand down, and he walked out. Not rushed, not dramatically, just out, like a man who had decided something and seen it through. The room stayed frozen for, I don't know, maybe 4 seconds, 5, and then it absolutely erupted. My mother's voice cut through everything else, the way it always does, sharp and certain. "What is happening?" Chloe's mother-in-law, former mother-in-law now, I suppose, began crying. People were standing, craning, turning to each other with wide eyes and open mouths. The officiant, bless him, looked like a man who had been trained for absolutely every wedding emergency except this one. And Chloe, whispers. Chloe stood at the altar alone for what must have felt to her like a geological age. And then her eyes moved across the room, scanning, processing, and they landed on me. I want to be honest here. I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I know that's what you might expect, the satisfying, cathartic rush of justice delivered. But what I actually felt was something much quieter and much sadder, because whatever Chloe had done, she was still my sister, and the expression on her face wasn't anger, not yet. It was something that looked a lot like a person realizing for the very first time that the performance they had been giving had finally run out of audience. She walked off the altar, not toward the exit Marcus had taken, toward the bridal suite. Petra rushed after her. My mother rushed after her. My father stood at the front of the room looking like a man whose entire internal architecture had just collapsed, and I found that I could not look at him for very long. People began dispersing, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, the way people move when they're desperate to be somewhere private so they can process something enormous. I remained in my seat. I don't know why, maybe because I didn't trust my legs, maybe because I felt I owed the moment some kind of witness, maybe just because I didn't have anywhere else to be. Marcus's best man appeared at my elbow about 10 minutes later, a quiet, careful man named James whom I had met twice before, and he said, very simply, "He told me you were the one who came to him. I just wanted you to know. He said you were brave." I started crying then, not the dramatic kind, the exhausted kind, the kind that comes when something you've been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to be put down. Whispers. Brave. I had never thought of it as brave. I had thought of it as impossible. I had thought of it as costly. I had spent 18 months thinking of it as the thing I didn't know how to do, and then the thing I was afraid to do, and then the thing I was doing despite being afraid. But brave? That took some sitting with. The fallout was predictably, inevitably, enormous. My phone started ringing within the hour. My mother first, then my aunt, then 2 cousins, then a family friend I hadn't spoken to in 4 years who had somehow already heard. The calls fell into 2 camps. the ones who wanted to understand, and the ones who had already decided. My mother was firmly, enthusiastically in the second camp. Her first words to me, I will carry these for a long time, were, "How could you do this to your sister on her wedding day?" Not, "Is any of it true?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "What happened?" Just, "How could you?" And there it was. The thing I had known was coming, the thing I had steeled myself for, the thing that had almost kept me quiet for 18 months. The reframe, the pivot. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Chloe's choices, it was about my choices. Suddenly, the question wasn't about what had happened to Marcus, what had happened to my friend, what had happened to anyone who had been deceived. The question was about me, about my timing, about my methods, about whether I had gone through the proper family channels, as if there's a formal grievance process for discovering your sister is systematically betraying people, before going to her fiancé. My father called 2 days later, quieter than my mother, always, but no less clear. He said he thought I had handled things poorly, that there might have been a better way, that family should come first. I asked him, and I asked this very carefully because I genuinely wanted to know, whether he thought Marcus deserved to know the truth before he married into our family. My father was quiet for a very long time, and then he said, "That's not the point." But it is. It is entirely the point. Chloe did not speak to me for 4 months. When she finally did, via a long, carefully written text message that I have read back several times since, she did not apologize. She said she understood that I had my reasons. She said that she had done things she wasn't proud of. She said she was working on herself. She said she hoped that in time we could find a way forward. I haven't responded yet. Not because I don't intend to, but because I'm still figuring out what I want to say, what I want a way forward to even look like, whether the family I thought I was protecting by staying quiet is the same family I have now, in the aftermath of speaking. Spoiler, it's not. Not exactly, but it's more honest. And honesty, I've learned, takes up less space than secrets, even when it's harder to live in. Marcus and I have spoken a few times since the wedding that wasn't. He's doing, I think the word is surviving. He said to me on one of those calls that the worst part wasn't the day itself, as awful as that had been. The worst part was looking back at the relationship and having to re-evaluate every moment he'd thought was real. The good memories don't stay good, he said. They just become evidence. I think about that a lot. My friend, the one who was hurt by Daniel, the one who had come back to me and said she wanted to be part of whatever I decided to do, she's doing better. We are better. The 3 months she didn't speak to me are behind us, and there's a different kind of honesty between us now, the kind that comes from having been through something real together, the kind that doesn't need to be curated. As for me, I still think about that Thursday evening in the hallway, the 40 minutes I sat in the car, the 18 months I chose silence. And I've made a kind of peace with the version of me who wasn't ready yet, because the version of me that finally spoke, she needed all of those months to get there, needed the grief, needed the evidence, needed the moment of looking at a friend's broken face and knowing she deserved better than my cowardice dressed up as discretion. I don't know what my relationship with my family looks like from here. I don't know if Chloe and I ever get to something that resembles sisterhood again. I don't know if my parents ever fully forgive me, or if forgiveness is even the right framework, since I'm not sure in the end that I did something that requires it. What I know is this. I walked into that barn carrying a secret that didn't belong to me, and I walked out having given it to the person it was always meant for. And if I had to do it again, knowing the cost, knowing the silence that followed, knowing every hard conversation and every unanswered call, and every night I lay awake wondering if I'd done the right thing, I would. I would do it again, every single time. Because the truth is heavy, but it's yours to carry. And secrets Secrets belong to the people who should never have made them in the first place.